The briefing is brought to you in association with Spain. From the wilds of the Atlantic to the warmth of Mediterranean isles, the Spanish coast has something for every occasion. And whether chartering a yacht or renting a more modest motorboat, there's no better way to explore this magical country's lesser-known highlights than from the open water. Listen out for a new summer season of The Concierge on Monocle Radio. Join Robert Bound and friends as they turn navigator for an unforgettable journey along the Spanish coast. From hidden gems to legendary gastronomy, and with the unique drama of the America's Cup in the host city of Barcelona added to the mix, discover why the time is right to take to the waves. The Concierge, returning to Monocle Radio in July. This summer, set sail for Spain.
You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 7th of August 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's programme, Hamas names a new leader and threatens retaliation against Israel along with Hezbollah. We'll look at the new leader, Yahya Sinwar, and whether his appointment means peace or more conflict in the Middle East. After that.
So you know what's out there, so say it with me. We aren't going back. We aren't going back.
Kamala Harris names football coach and geography teacher turned veteran turned Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as her running mate. But can the brand new Democratic ticket really take down former President Donald Trump? We'll also get a roundup of news from Asia, and finally,
it's easy in planning times to point out to what can go wrong, and it's normal to do that. The system has to be pushed to what can go wrong. What goes well, no one will witness.
We hear from the organizer of the Olympic Games, Christophe Dubi. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel sent the Middle East spiraling into one of its deadliest conflicts. With Israel having retaliated by killing thousands of Palestinians and much of Hamas's senior leadership, including political chief Ismail Haniyeh, the militant group has now named Yahya Sinwar, who is one of the architects of that October 7th attack, as its new leader. Israel has already vowed to pursue the death of Sinwar as well. Well, Layla Milana Allen is Monocle's Middle East correspondent. She joins me now. Layla, great to have you on the show. What do we know about Yahya Sinwar, first of all, and his role in the October 7th attacks in particular?
Hi, Chris. Yes, so Yahya Sinwar has, since 2017, been the head of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Now, he is a very hardline character. He's from Gaza himself. He was born in a refugee camp in the early 60s in Khan Yunis, which is Gaza's second city, which has come under heavy assault during this war, as everywhere else in the Strip. Now, he's been in jail 3 times. He was convicted of 4 life sentences by the Israelis on his last arrest. But then in 2011, there was a very famous prisoner swap for an Israeli soldier, and he was released as part of that. Ever since, he's been in Gaza, as I say, in leadership, and then the head of it since 2017. Now, it's believed that he is hiding deep down in these tunnels in Gaza. It's been impossible to get to him through this war, although the Israelis have been trying very hard. He is almost certainly, due to all the intelligence we have, the main orchestrator of the October 7th attacks, which were quite clearly planned from inside Gaza rather than with too much communication with Hamas leaders on the outside. Many other Hamas leaders live in Qatar. And one of the big concerns now with his appointment since the death of Ismail Haniyeh is that Ismail Haniyeh was, as Hamas leaders go, a more open character, more open to diplomacy. He was negotiating over a ceasefire in Qatar. Yahya Sinwar is very different. He is a hardline military guy, and many people are concerned that negotiations are now completely off the table with him in charge. And it seemed like a response to the Israelis to the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh that it was a unanimous vote within the Hamas leadership that Yahya Sinwar would take over, they say, as an act of defiance against the Israelis.
Layla, I mean, given everything you described there, how much more hardline Sinwar is than Haniyeh and sort of in line with Hamas's military wing, I just wonder if Israel will come to regret their decision to assassinate Haniyeh? Was that, the right course of action even for them, given, or perhaps is it sort of, in their opinion, Haniyeh didn't have much control anyway over what was happening in Gaza?
Well, that's exactly the question. Many people, when these double assassinations took place last week of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, which is a huge step in itself because it's also on Iran's sovereign territory, and incredibly embarrassing for them because it took place at the inauguration of the new president, Masoud Pezeshkian, who, obviously they had extra security there. So the fact that the Israelis were able to get in has been incredibly embarrassing for Iran and sort of brought new anger into this, as well as anger from Hamas. And it was sort of a long-term goal from them, and they haven't been able to get to Sinwar, which they're very angry about. So that is arguably why they carried it out now. But at the same time, they also assassinated this Hezbollah commander, Fuad Shukr, the second in command in Lebanon. And many people's reaction was, look, there are negotiations happening in Qatar between Hamas and Israel. You say you want these around 120 hostages in Israel who are still there to be released. Killing the man who is the chief negotiator for that ceasefire on the Hamas side does not actually seem like you do want peace. So there's been a lot of questions over that. Actually, has the Israeli government and the IDF decided that they just want to push this as far as they can go and take every opportunity now to eliminate people? And have they actually put Israeli civilians in a worse position now and potentially pushed the region to the edge of conflict by carrying out this assassination? Because it seems clear that Yahya Sinwar is not going to be willing to be involved, firstly, in negotiations. And secondly, it's much more difficult because previously many people criticized the Qatari government for allowing Hamas leaders to live there. But the reality is through this war, they have been invaluable because it's been possible to negotiate these ceasefires and hostage releases. If there isn't a Hamas leader in Qatar available to do that, it's going to be much more difficult to have any negotiations moving forward.
Layla, this region has been on the edge of conflict, as you put it, for quite a while now. There are once again calls from the U.S. for restraint. What do we know about how determined Hamas is to follow through on its threats to retaliate for the killing of Ismail Haniyeh, and also Hezbollah, for that matter, how much they are going to back any retaliation that Hamas carries out, and Iran, for that matter, as well?
On the Hamas side, we know very little. Obviously, throughout this war, Israel has been systematically going after Hamas leaders inside Gaza. Now, if, as they say, they claim that they managed over a month ago now to kill the military head of Hamas in Gaza, Mohammed Deif, if it's true that they have managed to eliminate him, they've managed to eliminate Haniyeh and several other people, really, Sinwar is the only sort of head, certainly on the military side, of Hamas around now. But whether they're actually able to retaliate, it's incredibly difficult to know. The Israelis say they've wiped out a huge number of Hamas battalions. Hamas respond that that's certainly not the case. And every time the Israelis leave an area of Gaza, Hamas fighters immediately fill it again. So whether they're actually able to launch an attack across the border in any way is unclear. They're more likely to try and launch a major strike against Israeli soldiers who are inside the Gaza Strip right now. On the Hezbollah side, Hassan Nasrallah, who's the head of Hezbollah, said initially, we will immediately react to this strike against Fuad Shukr. And one of the big red lines that Israel's crossed is that Fuad Shukr was killed in Beirut, in the southern suburbs of Beirut, which is a Hezbollah area. Now, Hezbollah has always said that is a red line for them. The south of Lebanon, which they also run, gets hit regularly. Beirut is different. Hamas, many people would argue, don't really care about the civilians that live in Gaza. Many of them see the deaths of Palestinians as kind of fodder for the cause, essentially. They call them martyrs. Hezbollah is very different in that way. They care deeply about the civilians living in their areas. They are a social and political organization as much as they're a military organization. And when you hit Beirut, a densely populated area, that affects their ability to say that they are looking after their citizens, that they can protect them. So that's a red line to cross. Hezbollah also has a chief position in the Lebanese government, which they don't want to jeopardize by allowing lots of Lebanese civilians to die on their watch. So yesterday, Hassan Nasrallah came out and he said, look, we are going to react, but we're not going to do it in a rash way. We're going to do it in a poised way. We're going to be calculated about this. So they need to find a response that is enough to say, we will not let you do this. We won't let you impinge on territory in Beirut. We won't let you carry out attacks that also kill civilians. 2 young children were killed when Fuad Shukr was assassinated, but at the same time isn't going to push the conflict to boiling point because Hezbollah does not want a war. And thirdly, Iran incredibly difficult for them to make a decision on this. Of course, their territorial integrity was compromised by this assassination. Very, very embarrassing for them. Ismail Haniyeh was incredibly close to the Iranian government, so it's also their relationship with Hamas now. There's a question over that. But they equally don't want a war. And the reality is, when they send missiles, as we've seen before, all of Israel's allies rally along with Israeli protections over Israeli territory to be able to bring down those missiles. So what they can do that makes enough of a statement without pushing this into full-blown war is a very difficult question. It's clear from the amount of time it's taken since these shock double assassinations for the Iranians, for Hamas, for Hezbollah to make a decision. It's clear that there's a lot of conversation going on about what exactly tone they want to strike with these retaliations.
Thank you very much, Layla, for that roundup of all the different reactions. That was Layla Milana Allen, Monocle's Middle East correspondent. And now here's Monocle's Henry Rees-Sheridan with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus has been named Bangladesh's interim leader. Yunus is a long-time political foe of ousted Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. Hasina fled the country on Monday following weeks of deadly anti-government protests. Student leaders of the protests refused to accept a military-led government and pushed for Yunus to lead the interim administration. Police in the UK are bracing for far-right demonstrations in up to 30 locations today. There has been nightly unrest in towns and cities across the country since last Tuesday, apparently in response to a knife attack in Southport that left 3 children dead. Far-right groups have been spurred by misinformation online that the suspect was an asylum seeker. Police chiefs say 120 people have been charged and 428 arrests made so far, with that number expected to rise significantly day by day. And Cathay Pacific is set to buy 30 Airbus A330-900 wide-body aircraft, with options to buy another 30. The purchase makes up the biggest chunk of a plan by the Hong Kong-based airline to invest $12.83 billion over the next 7 years to improve its fleet, cabin products, lounges and more. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Henry. Yesterday in Philadelphia, U.S. presidential candidate Kamala Harris held the biggest rally of her young presidential campaign. The rally coming after her biggest political decision yet in picking Minnesota Governor Tim Walz to be her running mate. The two appeared together in Philadelphia before embarking on a tour of battleground states. And with that, the overhauled make-or-break Democratic ticket charged with defeating Donald Trump has been set, with 90 days to go now until November's presidential election. Joining me to discuss more of this is the Washington reporter Simon Marks, right here in our Midori House studio. Good afternoon, Simon.
Good afternoon to you, Chris.
Simon, before we get started, we want to play one clip of Tim Walz at yesterday's rally, the one that really got the biggest applause line.
And make no mistake, violent crime was up under Donald Trump. That's not even counting the crimes he committed.
Simon, this was one aspect of Tim Walz. He obviously also introduced himself. Kamala Harris introduced him as well. Bit of a attack dog. He had quite a few sort of really spiky lines in his speech. Well, what did you make of his performance?
I thought it was astonishing, and astonishing in the context, Chris, of the fact that so many people were surprised by his selection. We knew this was coming down to the last two, Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota and Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania. And of course, the fact that the event had been booked to take place in Philadelphia led so many political observers, myself included, to think it's got to be Josh Shapiro. And then there was this surprise announcement that it is going to be Tim Walz. And once you saw the two of them on the stage there yesterday, throughout that rally, it kind of made sense. I mean, immediately it made sense. I mean, the chemistry between them playing out yesterday, if they can replicate that through the Democratic Party's convention, which is coming up the week after next in Chicago, and then for the remainder of this election campaign, they will feel very confident. And Kamala Harris, after that rally, put out a fundraising message. I mean, a fundraising message was put out in her name. And the subject line of that email simply reads, Tim Walz, leader, fighter, patriot. And that is absolutely how they are characterizing him. And that is exactly how he presented himself yesterday.
Well, and he is also, you could argue, straight out of central casting, frankly, with this mix that he has. Geography teacher, football coach, veteran as well, then turned congressman and governor of Minnesota, but also just the way he speaks. He's, of course, famously the architect, if you will, of this line calling Donald Trump and J.D. Vance simply weird, yes, which has taken on so much. And I think what I was curious to get your take on is just this sort of levity that he brings. Do we get the sense that this is one of the ways the Democrats now hope to defeat Donald Trump? Have they been too doomsday about all of this? This is one of the arguments, even though this is, of course, a serious campaign about threats to democracy and the like. He's kind of taking a different tact on approaching that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to underscore that vice presidential choices rarely affect the outcome of elections, unless, of course, you pick the wrong nominee. I mean, Sarah Palin,
but he's changing
John
the
McCain.
entire rhetoric of the campaign as well.
He is changing absolutely the pattern of this campaign. And there are two contrasts that are being drawn. There's the contrast between Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, right, and Tim Walz and Joe Biden, the Democratic Party suddenly realizing that not only was a pressure gauge opened when Joe Biden dropped out of the race, but that all of the conversations that were taking place a year ago, Nancy Pelosi and others saying we can't have a competitive primary, Joe Biden, we've got to rally around him. I mean, with hindsight, Democrats at the grassroots must now be recognizing that that was crazy, that you could absolutely have charted this transition earlier. But the other contrast is absolutely between the team of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz and Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. Donald Trump has lost his way since that Republican convention in Milwaukee. He seems to have been absolutely blindsided almost by Biden's decision to leave the race. And J.D. Vance, as we know, has stumbled in the early moments of his status as Donald Trump's running mate, to the point where Donald Trump has sort of indicated, I mean, that there might be a bit of buyer's remorse on his part about the choice that he's made. So if they can keep this up, if they can find that magic, Harris and Walz working together, Trump and J.D. Vance, the onus now is on them to find a way of responding. And also, finally, I mean, as you were saying earlier, who doesn't love in middle America a high school football coach? I mean, the resume is just like absolutely perfect for the task that he's been brought in to achieve, which is to turn that vote out for Kamala Harris and himself now in the Midwest.
It is also interesting, as you talk there about these fears of a transition that existed before Biden's decision. This could have gone another way in that there would have been a campaign for a new candidate. And you can almost imagine now how that might have gone if someone like Tim Walz had also gotten involved. And in that context, I just wanted to ask you, I mean, this whole vice presidential decision has almost felt like a little mini campaign in itself. Yeah. And in that sense, a word on Josh Shapiro, because he was the sort of, potential vice presidential pick. And I do wonder if there is any internal Democratic debate about Gaza also being settled. Definitely. With this that will remain a sore spot. He was going to be the first Jewish vice presidential candidate. This is something that Republicans are picking up on. Well,
I'm not sure if it's a sore spot that's going to linger for the Democrats, because in a sense, one of the most important things that happened yesterday was that Josh Shapiro was on the stage there in Pennsylvania, absolutely indicating that he is committed to doing the job that Kamala Harris wanted him to do if she had put him on the ticket. Bring Pennsylvania home. He's insanely popular there. He has never called for a surrender in Gaza by the Israeli military, for a ceasefire rather, in Gaza by the Israeli military. That was, and the Palestinian forces, Hamas. That was going to be problematic for the ticket as Kamala Harris tries to turn around a pretty beleaguered situation for Democrats in Michigan, a critical state. Tim Walz, by contrast, has the capacity to try and reach out, Kamala Harris believes, to core counties in 4 states, his own state, Minnesota, Illinois, Iowa and Wisconsin, that voted twice for Barack Obama, but in 2016 voted for Donald Trump. And the Democrats, absolutely want to bring those votes voters home. And they think, Kamala Harris thinks, that Tim Walz has broader appeal in those counties because of his roots in Minnesota than Josh Shapiro necessarily would have had coming as he does from Pennsylvania. I think that the Middle Eastern issue was an element to her decision-making, but ultimately she's got him on side anyway, and she hopes that he will deliver Pennsylvania. If they win in November, all of this will be considered, a masterstroke. If they lose in November to Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, the recriminations are going to get very ugly.
Well, finally, Simon, just to that point of whether they will win or lose, it is easy in these moments as either media or just among Democrats to kind of get carried away in this giant show of Democratic unity and enthusiasm that we are seeing. That said, the polls have not moved that much. They are showing maybe now Kamala Harris with a slight edge where Joe Biden, by comparison, was behind Donald Trump. Do you really get the sense that the public is going to buy into this brand new Democratic unity and Democratic ticket? The
Republicans are going to hammer away. They are already hammering away on the notion that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, because he's a darling of the progressive left wing of the Democratic Party, are so far left that they've left America. There were emails going out from the Trump campaign yesterday saying, in the words of one, quoting Donald Trump, Governor Tim Walz is going to unleash hell on earth. They say that they want to replicate what's been going on in California, all of the left-wing policies that they ascribe to Governor Gavin Newsom, and bring it to the national stage. So that's going to be the strategy. And I think it's important to remember that on the day that Joe Biden dropped out of the race, Joe Biden's approval rating was 38.5%. Kamala Harris's approval rating was 38.6%. So the turnaround has to be for longer than just a couple of weeks. And, through the Democratic National Convention, they've got a big sales job to do between now and November the 5th. The polling at the moment indicates that they may have started that quest, but there's a big mountain to climb before Democrats can begin to think that this is a safe election for them.
Simon, thank you very much for joining us. That was the Washington journalist Simon Marks. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. I'm Chris Chermak, and we'll turn our focus now to Asia to get the latest news from the region. I'm joined by Aaron Cook, the Jakarta-based journalist and author of Dari Mulut ke Mulut, a newsletter about Southeast Asia. Good afternoon, Aaron.
Hi, how you going?
Very good, thank you. Aaron, we have some breaking news that we are going to start with from the last few hours. There has now been a ruling. This is something we discussed on the Globus this morning, but a Thai court has now ruled ordering the dissolution of the country's most popular party.
That's it. I think a few supporters and certainly few in Move Forward will be surprised with the outcome here. Widely expected, but still very upsetting to see the party forcibly dissolved by the Constitutional Court. It follows a challenge from the Election Commission saying that the party had really crossed the line in its policies by pushing for reforms of the draconian lèse-majesté laws. And they're saying, what they really want is to tear down the monarchy, and that's way too far for the Thai political system.
And to that point, then, I guess, whether this was too far or not, what does that mean for Thai politics going forward? How will people react to this ruling?
This is going to be very, very interesting to watch in the next few days. This has happened to a previous party. Move Forward is actually the second incarnation of Future Forward, which was forcibly dissolved back in 2020. The Thai government got kind of lucky there with the pandemic, of course, hitting the country. So protests were beginning to really ramp up. And then with those restrictions, they had an excuse to shut it all down. What happens this time, though, is still really, really up in the air. The voting base, the supporter base, is much stronger and larger for Move Forward than it ever was for Future Forward. But it is very, very sort of middle class. These aren't typically the types of people that go out into the streets of Bangkok and get involved with these sorts of demonstrations that we have seen in the past get very violent, very deadly. So what happens is definitely still up in the air at this stage.
Well, let's move on to another sort of political hotbed at the moment. The junta in Myanmar has been facing down rebels as well, and they're being increasingly open about how much ground they've lost.
Yes, this is interesting. That virtually this whole year, the junta have kind of been playing down and pushing back against sort of accusations that they're losing ground, that they're not really in control of the country at all. But in the last couple of weeks, they've kind of fessed up and have been a bit like, oh, well, yeah, actually we are. They're fighting multiple fronts, multiple People's Defence Forces across the country, from the China border to in the middle and across the Indian border as well, or along the Indian border as well. So they're losing ground very, very quickly. And it looks like they're not going to be able to regain all of it as well.
And just to follow up on that, I mean, what does that actually mean? Are we expecting at some point that the junta will be actually losing this war?
This is a very, very big and very scary question, because when the junta, if and when the junta fails, what happens then for Myanmar? At this point, it is so fractured that it's unlikely a party like Aung San Suu Kyi's National League of Democracy would be able to kind of come up and bring it all together. The National Unity Government, which was the civilian government that was ousted in 2021, they say that they're the ones that will be able to retake control. But these divisions across multiple states are so divisive that it's unlikely we'll be able to see a cohesive nation state, regardless of what happens in the coming year or so.
It's been a difficult time for Myanmar. Well, finally, one other story I wanted to discuss with you, Erin, something interesting out of Malaysia. The Prime Minister has been taking on Meta.
Yes, he's Anwar Ibrahim. He's definitely one of the more outspoken leaders down here in Southeast Asia, and he's certainly not afraid to take on Meta. He posted a tribute to the Hamas leader, Ismail Haniyeh, who died last week. And that post was removed from Facebook. So he's really, really unhappy about that. He's a very outspoken supporter of Hamas, and says that he should be able to send a tribute to that leader. Meta has since sort of apologised and said we're going to put it back, and sorry for that one. But it's really gotten under Anwar Ibrahim's skin. There's now talk about, does Malaysia have the capacity to build its own social media network with its own values? So probably not, but that's what they're thinking.
Everyone unhappy with Meta in one shape or form. That was Erin Cook in Jakarta. Thank you very much for joining us. This is The Briefing. And finally, on today's show, we'll cross over to Paris, where our team has been broadcasting as part of our coverage of the Olympic and Paralympic Games. We are now midway through the second week of the Games. So how is it all going from the organizers' point of view? Well, to find out more, earlier, Monocle's Emma Nelson was joined by Christophe Dubi. He's the Olympic Games Executive Director for the International Olympic Committee. 3 decades ago, he joined as a trainee at the IOC. He now has responsibility for the overall management and coordination of the Olympic and Youth Olympic Games. Emma started by asking Christophe how they campaigned to bring Parisians on side for the Games.
It's normal in a venture of this size, this degree of sophistication, that people are asking questions. And yes, it's easy in planning times to point out to what can go wrong. And it's normal to do that. The system has to be pushed to what can go wrong. What goes well, no one will witness, but what can go wrong? From the media to civil society, we get these questions constantly. Thing is, when you take a little bit of a step back, and we have delivered a few games over the last decades, not to that degree of audacious ideas and creativity, but nevertheless, in the main, if you take a step back and you were looking in January, what could go wrong? Yes, you had a few elements, but it was really, really well designed. The main concern that we always had from the final of the Champions League was the integration of security forces. It failed a few years ago for one game, and there we're speaking about 80 to 85 games equivalent every day. And from that moment in time, all efforts were on integration of planning, starting with security forces. And we knew for a long time that there was one person deciding at the end of the chain, and the rest was planning in an integrated fashion. So, we had all the markers being green. What we didn't anticipate, though, was this immense popular success that we see today with stadiums absolutely crowded and the streets being crowded too. This is called managing success, right?
It is lovely, and and Paris feels special, and Paris feels different, and Paris feels as if it's in a very magical bubble for two weeks, and then we'll have the Paralympic Games after that. What about getting Parisians on side? Because that became one of the famous stories.
Yeah, I'm stunned about the behavior of the Parisians and the acceptance for games which are very disturbant, especially to the center of Paris, right? We had all the security measures prior to the opening ceremony and all these road closures throughout the day. I think one of the explanations why we have the support is that for many Parisians, the game started earlier and delivered goods, especially in Seine-Saint-Denis, but in the schools as well, in the sports club, right before the games, or I would say even a few years prior to the games. Before we're speaking about the legacy of the games, which is always the after 17 days. There they anticipated and delivered some of the programs prior to the games. And I think it really helped in the acceptance of all these measures that are constraints. But in the end, again, from businesses to citizens, they all came together.
Tell me how you reconfigured the approach to hosting a games when you started to work with Paris, insofar as you've spoken in the past about how the way that the Olympics need to approach their role is that they must no longer make a city work with them. The Olympics must now work within a city. Tell me how you came to that conclusion and how that has borne out here in Paris.
Many examples in the past, and I could cite the development in Hellenico Airport in Athens. We still have scars from what happened there. Developments of venues which are never used for the sole purpose of the games. Bobsleigh track in Torino, not used. We can't have that anymore. The games have to adapt to a city and a region, not the reverse. And this is what you see here in Paris. Yes, they have built two venues because they're needed for the community long term. One is a multi-purpose hall, basketball mainly, and the second is a swimming pool, both, by the way, in Seine-Saint-Denis. And the villages in Seine-Saint-Denis as well, for the media and for the athletes. Why? Because this is a disfranchised community that need those venues. We could have built a temporary venue. We did it in London for basketball. You remember in the park? There we decided to go to Lille. And it makes sense to go to Lille because we had a fabulous venue there, right? Is it longer to go to Lille than something temporarily built in Paris? Yes. Does it change the experience starting from the athletes and for all of those than being in the venues or watching on TV? Absolutely not. Okay, and this is what we have done. In addition to simplifying all requirements, we don't need to have 3 stars restaurants across the Olympic Theatre. We can go with a sandwich and a salad when it makes sense. In the Champ de Mars, for example, where you have an offer next door to your hotel in Bercy, well, you have kitchen. Then you can have more elaborate menus. So this is the kind of things where we say, let's be as simple as we can. The games are complicated enough in their essence to simplify everything else that can be simplified. So Paris is a beautiful demonstration of how it can work.
Tell me one last question. It's probably an unfair one because we're not at the end yet of the Olympics at least. But if there was one thing that you will take away from Paris, even if it's the slightest, tiniest moment, you know, what would you tell someone who you met in the street about, you must go and look at this or you must go and revisit that? What was it?
Not everybody will be able to do that. I went with my colleague Anouk to Seine-Saint-Denis, and this is 2 weeks prior to the games, going to school. and they had prepared their Olympic song, and I will make sure that it is sent to you, right? It's school kids, their age probably 5 to 10. You know what? I was crying. I was like, okay, that does it for me. When the games mean that these communities there, they are singing, and the text is absolutely fantastic. It's so simple, so basic, so human, that you feel you have left something in that community in Paris. 2 weeks prior, I take it any day.
That was an emotional Christophe Dubi, the Olympic Games Executive Director for the International Olympic Committee, in conversation with Monocle's Emma Nelson. Head over to monocle.com to subscribe to Monocle in Paris, our podcast bringing you the latest from the French capital during the Games. And that's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Carlotta Ribello. Our researchers were Gunnar Grunlid, Monica Lillis and Sana Jumani. Our studio manager was Flynn Simons. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Termack. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.